In one of the fading municipal hospitals on the outskirts of Trenton, New Jersey, the hallway lights buzzed with a dull, electric hum. Paint peeled at the corners of the ceiling, and time left its traces on everything, from the scratched linoleum floors to the faded signs hanging crooked above the nurses' stations. At the far end of the third floor, tucked behind a heavy door whose nameplate had long since fallen off, lay an old man in a narrow hospital bed. The staff referred to him simply as the patient without a name. It was less a title than a habit, passed from one shift to another, like a set of keys or the logbook of vitals. No one knew how long exactly he had been there. According to the paper trail, he had been admitted over 8 years earlier after being found unconscious on a city bench in a snowstorm. He had no ID, no wallet, and no phone. His clothes were threadbare but clean, and his shoes, worn almost to the sole, suggested a man used to walking long distances. The ambulance report listed him as male, approximately in his 70s, with no visible injuries and no signs of intoxication. They brought him in, cleaned him up, ran basic tests, and waited for someone to come forward. No one did. His case had long ago slipped through the cracks of administrative attention. Medical residents rotated out, heads of departments changed, social workers gave up. Paperwork went missing, misfiled, or never filed at all. Somewhere his real name might still have existed, typed into an old system or scribbled on the margin of a clipboard, but no one knew where. Over the years, he became a fixture, a quiet, unobtrusive presence in a corner room most doctors walked past without a second glance. He did not speak, not once. Some thought he might have suffered a stroke. Others suspected trauma or deep psychological withdrawal. But the truth was harder to pin down, perhaps because no one truly tried. He responded to basic instructions, moved his hand for blood pressure cuffs, swallowed pills when placed in front of him, and nodded or did nothing. When people asked him questions, he stared through them. Yet he wasn't catatonic. His eyes moved with intent. He observed everything, the comings and goings of the nurses, the shifting angle of sunlight through the blinds, the buzz of televisions from other rooms. There was no glassy fog in his gaze. It was alert, quietly calculating. Occasionally, he wrote, a small spiral-bound notebook rested by his bedside, its cover dog-eared and soft from years of use. Nurses noticed it, but few ever read what was inside. When they did, they found pages of odd sketches, outlines of streets, maps with no names, grids of square houses, sometimes just clusters of dates or phrases written in cursive. Nothing that seemed dangerous or even particularly meaningful. Some assumed he was simply entertaining himself. Others considered it a sign of cognitive confusion. But the notebook never left his side. He guarded it in small, imperceptible ways, angling it toward the wall, slipping it beneath his pillow when visitors entered, tucking it under his blanket when he slept. Outside his room, life moved at hospital pace, hurried, chaotic, and repetitive. Doctors made rounds with their white coats flapping like sails. Nurses wheeled carts of medication from room to room, scanning wristbands, injecting fluids, ticking boxes. Orderlies changed linens, disinfected trays, and kept their eyes low. Every room had its own rhythm, moaning, beeping, coughing, the muted voices of television hosts debating politics or giving away prizes. Amid all of it, the nameless man remained still, like an anchor sunk in the floor. No visitors ever came. Over the years, volunteers brought holiday cards, baked goods, crocheted blankets. He accepted them politely but never acknowledged the occasion. He did not smile at the plastic trees placed in the hallway each December or the fake pumpkins in October. Once, a chaplain came and read aloud from the Psalms. The man closed his eyes not in prayer, but in quiet resistance. The chaplain never returned. His case had once stirred mild curiosity. New hires sometimes asked about him. What's his story? Why hasn't anyone claimed him? But answers were always vague. He's always been here. I think they tried to trace him. Maybe he wants to be forgotten. Over time, the questions stopped. The hospital was full of people barely holding on to threads of family, of language, of memory. One more man without a name did not shock anyone. Sometimes, especially at night, the man would sit upright, legs dangling over the side of the bed. He would hold the notebook in his lap and stare at the door as if expecting someone to walk through it. Once or twice a week, he shuffled slowly to the window, resting his palms on the sill, gazing out at the parking lot below. He lingered there for long minutes, unmoving, then returned to bed on his own, unaided. His body held up better than many expected. He rarely fell ill, never complained of pain. His vitals stayed within normal range. The doctors called it stable, though the term sounded more like resignation than relief. Stability meant he was easy to manage. A blank space on the chart, a bed occupied but not questioned. In the hospital's digital system, he was labeled as John Doe 112-A, assigned a placeholder ID and a billing code no one could charge. Insurance providers rejected the file. Funding ran thin. Sometimes administrators floated the idea of transferring him to a long-term care facility, but without identification, legal guardianship, or consent, there was nowhere to send him. So he remained year after year like furniture no one knew who had brought in or where it belonged. And so the routine continued. Nurses changed, uniforms changed, technology advanced. But the man in the room at the end of the corridor remained a constant presence. His hair turned white, then thin. His notebook filled, then was replaced. His posture became more bent, his steps slower. But his eyes never lost that alert stillness, the suggestion that somewhere inside, something had not let go. No one in the hospital would have guessed that this man, seemingly forgotten by time, held on to something far more precise than memory. He was waiting, not for recovery, not for freedom, but for a moment unknown to everyone but himself, when the silence would finally be broken. Until then, he existed in the margins, a name unspoken, a story unwritten, watching from his quiet corner as the world hurried past. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor flickered with the same soft hum, but something had shifted. It was the first day of a new rotation, and with it came fresh faces, fresh minds, and the inevitable idealism that briefly followed youth into these beige-painted walls. Dr. Linda Reyes had only just begun her residency. Eager, sharp-eyed, and perhaps still carrying traces of university optimism, she moved through her early tasks with quiet precision, determined to learn everything and overlook nothing. Assigned to the geriatric ward, Linda spent her first day shadowing the senior staff, charting medication times, checking vitals, and reviewing case files. Most of the patients were exactly as expected: elderly, frail, some alert, others lost in a haze of confusion or sedation. But at the end of the hall, past the heavy door with no label, she found something that wasn't listed on her rotation sheet. A man, elderly, thin, sitting upright in bed with an almost statue-like stillness. She paused just long enough to notice that the name field on the chart clipped to the wall was blank. In its place, a faded sticker read, John Doe 112-A. The file was unusually thin, one page of vitals, a few scrawled notes from years ago, and a post-it stuck to the front reading, DNR, no ID. No diagnosis, no medical history, no psychiatric notes. Linda flipped through it twice, confused. He had no assigned primary physician, no scheduled rounds, no contact log. He wasn't listed in the internal tracking app. It was as if the man existed outside the hospital systems, a shadow lodged in bureaucracy. When she asked a senior nurse during break, the response was casual, almost indifferent. He's been here forever, came in before half the current staff, doesn't speak, doesn't cause problems. Not much to do. Linda pressed for more, but the nurse just shrugged. He's fine. We give him food, meds, he sleeps, sometimes writes in that little notebook. You'll learn to walk past him like we all do. But Linda didn't walk past him. That evening, after finishing her rounds, she returned to the door at the end of the hall. The man was still there, sitting as he had been before, his thin fingers resting on a small spiral-bound notebook. His hair was a ghostly white, his skin pale but not sickly, and though his body showed signs of age, it was his eyes that caught her, the clarity in them, as if he saw her more deeply than she expected. They didn't look hollow, they looked patient. She didn't speak. She simply stood there for a few minutes, quietly observing. He watched her, then slowly turned back to the notebook, shielding it subtly with his arm as he continued drawing. She couldn't see what he wrote, but from where she stood, she could make out geometric lines, straight and curved, overlapping each other like the skeletons of neighborhoods. Over the next few days, Linda made it a point to stop by. She left a newspaper on his table one morning. The next day, a paperback novel. Then an old faded photo of downtown Trenton from the 1960s she found in a donated archive box. He never spoke, never gestured, but she began to notice the smallest changes. When she left the photo, he turned it over slowly, tracing the edges with his fingers. When she left a book, he placed it beside the notebook carefully, as if adding it to a private collection. Sometimes she watched him sketch. Always the same methodical lines. Streets, buildings, intersections. Once she thought she recognized a corner she'd driven past that morning. The drawings weren't random. They followed a logic she couldn't fully grasp. He wasn't simply passing time. He was reconstructing something. Memory, maybe, or direction, or perhaps a version of both. As days turned into weeks, Linda noticed a subtle shift in the man's posture. His shoulders, once slouched, began to square a little. His eyes followed her more directly when she entered. One afternoon, she brought in a photo of a street sign she'd taken outside the hospital. He looked at it for a long time, then carefully pulled out his notebook and flipped through dozens of pages until he found a map that resembled the area. He tapped the spot once and looked back at her. It was the first time he'd initiated any form of response. Linda kept her efforts informal. She mentioned him to a few attending physicians, but most waved her off. There was no funding for a psychological reevaluation. No ID meant no billing, no next of kin, no insurance. He was a ghost in the system, and the system had no appetite for ghosts. So she continued on her own. Quiet visits, small offerings, trying not to disrupt his rhythm, but always leaving behind something new. Eventually, she tried asking him questions. Not aloud, she knew it wouldn't work, but by writing them on slips of paper. Where were you born? Do you remember your name? What year did you come here? At first, he ignored them, but one morning, she found one of the slips on her desk in the nurse's station. On it, he had written 2 words. Trust takes time. It was the first time he'd communicated directly. She held on to the note, keeping it folded in her coat pocket like a small breakthrough. It confirmed what she had already suspected. He wasn't lost in mind, only in circumstance. Whatever had happened to him, it hadn't destroyed his memory. It had only buried it under layers of silence and caution. He wasn't mute. He was choosing not to speak. Not yet. Linda began piecing together a theory. The maps weren't just sketches. They were memories. Maybe attempts to retrace his past, or places he hoped to return to. His choice not to speak might have stemmed from trauma, or simply from the certainty that no one had listened in a long time. But with each small exchange, she saw a thawing in him, a softening. He didn't smile in the traditional sense, but there were moments, tiny flickers in his eyes, slight shifts in his expression, that conveyed acknowledgement. Her presence wasn't met with suspicion anymore. It was welcome. And that, more than any words, told her she was reaching him. Still, questions remained. Why had no one searched for him? Had he disappeared by choice or by accident? What had made him vanish so thoroughly that not even a paper trail remained? Linda didn't know yet, but she was determined to find out. What mattered now was the thread she had begun to pull, the thin but undeniable line of connection between a man lost to the world and a doctor who refused to let him remain invisible. Something inside her told her that once unraveled, the thread would lead somewhere he could finally call home again. But for now she waited, as he did. Both of them caught in the space between silence and speech, memory and rediscovery. The corridors of the hospital, once merely clinical and cold, began to feel different to Linda. Not because they changed, but because she now walked them with purpose, with urgency. Her quiet routine of leaving books and photographs had evolved into a mission. The man at the end of the hallway was no longer just a curiosity. He had a past. He had a story, and Linda was determined to uncover it. It began late one night when the shift was slow and the computers momentarily idle. She logged into the hospital's internal record system, searching again for anything linked to the man listed only as John Doe 112-A. The record was still blank, still floating outside the normal databases. No insurance, no emergency contact, no hospital of origin. But this time, Linda looked beyond the electronic files. She went to the archive room in the basement. Few staff visited the basement. The room smelled of dust and bleach, filled with rows of metal drawers, boxes of forgotten files, and outdated equipment. She combed through boxes labeled by year, searching for handwritten admission logs from around a decade ago. It took her hours, but eventually, she found a nurse's ledger from 9 years back. The handwriting was tight and hurried, but one entry stood out. Male, approximately 70, unconscious, no ID, found near train station, transferred from county ER. Mental health eval requested, placed under observation. It was dated almost exactly 9 years prior. The age matched, the lack of ID matched, and the destination listed was the same room where the silent man still lived. Encouraged, Linda returned night after night, piecing together fragments of paper trails. In an old intake binder, she found a carbon copy transfer order with a partial thumbprint and the scribbled initials of a social worker. With growing determination, she took a risk. She quietly scanned the thumbprint using a fingerprint scanner from the intake desk and ran it against public databases, using a login borrowed from an IT intern who owed her a favor. The result came back the next day. Match found Robert Hale, born March 11, 1941, former high school history teacher, reported missing in 2006 by a former student who had stayed in touch. No known family, no police record, listed as missing person, inactive by the FBI. Linda stared at the screen for a long time. Robert Hale, not John Doe, not a ghost or a blank, a man with a name, a profession, a life. Her heart pounded as she printed the results and carefully clipped them to the outside of the man's folder. She brought the file to the office of Dr. Grayson, the head of the ward, a man known more for administrative efficiency than compassion. He listened without much expression as she laid out the story, her voice quiet but firm. She presented the intake log, the fingerprint match, the printed FBI report. When she finished, she expected a reaction: shock, concern, gratitude. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. His response was calm but heavy. He told her to leave it alone. There were complexities she didn't understand. The case, he said, had been put to rest years ago. Robert had been mistakenly admitted under a psychiatric hold. The records were incomplete, the initial diagnosis unverified, and the hospital had no protocol to properly trace his identity after the initial intake. Over time, no one claimed him, and he became part of the system, a system that had chosen, deliberately or not, to forget him. Linda asked if it was about legal liability. Dr. Grayson didn't deny it. Reopening a case like this could expose the hospital to a scandal. There would be questions about negligence, about abandonment, about how a mentally competent man could be locked in a facility without his name or consent for nearly a decade. The administration had no desire for a lawsuit or a media circus, and since Robert had never spoken, had never asked for help, it was easier to leave things as they were. Linda left the office in disbelief. The man had been a teacher. Someone had once trusted him with young minds, and now he was being kept invisible to protect reputations. The betrayal angered her deeply. She had seen the spark in his eyes, the maps in his notebooks, the flickers of awareness and memory. He hadn't disappeared by choice. He had been misplaced, mislabeled, and forgotten. She returned to his room that night. He was awake, sitting as he often did, notebook in hand. She didn't speak. She simply placed the printed file on the small table beside his bed, the page with his name in bold, Robert Hale. He looked down at it, unmoving for several seconds. Then very slowly, he reached out. He picked up the paper, stared at it. His eyes didn't show surprise, only a deep, unreadable emotion. He traced his fingers over the name. After a while, he put it down and turned to a blank page in his notebook. With deliberate care, he began to draw. Not a map this time, but a house. A small, single-story home with a porch and a tree out front. It looked like it had been drawn from memory. The next morning, Linda was called into the director's office. Her actions had raised flags. She was cautioned about exceeding her authority, warned about the consequences of digging into closed cases. But she didn't back down. She had seen the man. She had seen his eyes, and now she had seen his name. That changed everything. Linda understood that she had reached a point of no return. If she chose to back off now, Robert would remain forgotten. But if she kept going, she would have to confront the hospital's silence, the systemic failure that had left him nameless for nearly a decade. It was no longer just about him. It was about how easily the system could erase a person and how easily the people within it could let that happen. She chose to keep going. She began contacting missing persons networks, reaching out to the student who had filed the original report. She quietly prepared a dossier with every document, every note. She knew it might cost her, but she didn't care. Not anymore, because Robert Hale had waited long enough, and silence, she now understood, was not the same as absence. Linda sat in her car outside the hospital for nearly an hour the next morning. The air was heavy with the weight of decisions made and consequences yet to come. Inside the folder on her lap were copies of everything she had gathered: hospital logs, fingerprint confirmation, case notes, and most importantly, pages from Robert Hale's notebook. She had scanned a few of his sketches and the quiet notes he left on the margins, capturing pieces of a world that refused to be silenced. She knew what she was about to do would not be welcome. The hospital had already made it clear they intended to keep the matter internal. They wanted the problem to remain a closed file, buried under bureaucracy. But Linda could no longer pretend that the quiet in those corridors was peace. It was neglect dressed in sterile uniforms. That afternoon, she walked into the small office of the local newspaper, a modest publication run out of a converted Victorian home downtown. She handed her folder to an editor named Karen, a woman in her 40s with a reputation for digging where no one else dared. Linda expected skepticism, maybe even dismissal. Instead, Karen leafed through the contents with growing intensity, her eyes narrowing as she reached the photocopied fingerprint report. Then she looked up and simply said, "We'll run it." The story hit the press 3 days later. The headline was restrained but clear: "Man Without a Name, the Forgotten Patient of Essex County Hospital." The article detailed how a former teacher had been mistakenly institutionalized and left without identity or advocacy for nearly a decade. It included quotes from anonymous sources within the hospital, excerpts from Robert's notebook, and a timeline of the hospital's failure to investigate. Linda's name wasn't mentioned, but her fingerprints were all over the story. The response was immediate. Local news stations picked up the article, and within days, state officials announced a formal inquiry. A team of inspectors arrived at the hospital, their presence undeniable, badges flashing, clipboards in hand, questions slicing through routines like scalpels. Administrators scrambled to explain the oversight. Doctors fumbled through justifications, but none of them could answer the most pressing question: how could a man live among them for 9 years, voiceless and unnamed, and no one ever asked who he truly was? The hospital, perhaps hoping to contain the damage, began rapid internal reviews. They officially classified Robert as a ward of the state, granting him a legal status that included access to a public defender and a patient advocate. For the first time in 9 years, Robert Hale had legal representation. A caseworker was assigned, and a social worker began to review his psychological assessments. The original notes from his admission were found vague, incomplete, based more on assumption than diagnosis. But more remarkable than the administrative shift was the reaction of the community. The newspaper office received hundreds of letters, many addressed directly to Robert. Some came from former students who remembered him as a kind, passionate teacher. Others came from strangers moved by the injustice. People sent flowers, books, even small tokens: a lapel pin from a school club, an old yearbook, photographs from school plays and graduation ceremonies. One letter included a faded class picture with Robert standing at the edge, smiling in a way that was unmistakable, even through decades in dust. Then came a message from a man named Daniel Brooks. He had been in Robert's senior history class 20 years earlier and had gone on to become a civil rights attorney. The article had stunned him. He reached out to the paper, then to the hospital, offering his services pro bono. He remembered Robert as a mentor, a man who encouraged independent thought and treated every student with respect. Now he intended to return that respect. Daniel met Robert the following week. The visit was short, conducted under supervision, but it left a mark. Robert did not speak, but he listened intently, watching Daniel with eyes no longer dulled by isolation. There was something else there now. Focus, attention, the faint flicker of resolve. Linda continued to visit as well, though now her role had shifted. She was no longer just the quiet observer or the unnoticed intern. She was the catalyst. Staff treated her differently, some with admiration, others with caution. But Robert, as always, acknowledged her with a slight nod, a glance that held more weight than words. One afternoon, she entered his room to find something new on the bedside table. A worn copy of the Federalist Papers and an unopened envelope with her name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Robert had written a single sentence in a neat, steady hand. "Thank you for remembering that silence is not the same as consent." She didn't show the letter to anyone. It was enough to know that he was watching, absorbing, reclaiming fragments of the man he had once been. Outside the hospital, protests began to form. Small at first, people holding signs, wearing buttons with Robert's face and the word justice. But they grew quickly. Advocates for elder care reform, mental health policy, and civil rights began using his story as a symbol. Hashtags spread online. Lawmakers mentioned the case in state hearings. Journalists tracked every development. The hospital, under pressure, issued a statement promising transparency and reform. But those closest to the case knew real change would take more than press releases. It would require a reckoning. Through it all, Robert remained in his room. He still drew in his notebooks, though now his sketches were different. Less about buildings and streets, and more about people. Faces, hands, crowds. He even began sketching his visitors. Linda found herself drawn in graphite on a page, standing beside Daniel in a window full of light. No one forced him to speak. No one expected him to. But his silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like resistance, a deliberate choice, a form of control. And in a world that had tried to erase him, that choice mattered more than words. Linda watched as something shifted in the hospital, slow but undeniable. The old rhythms of apathy and protocol began to fray. People asked more questions. They read Robert's story. They looked at their own patients differently. She had gone against the current and discovered that sometimes the only way to save someone was to stop waiting for permission. Robert Hale had waited in the margins for 9 years. Now he was at the center, and the world had no choice but to look. Several weeks passed after the article's publication and the subsequent public outcry. The hospital's routines shifted under the weight of scrutiny, and administrators worked to manage the damage as best they could. But the changes that mattered most were quieter, more deliberate. In a small courtroom not far from the hospital, Daniel Brooks stood before a judge with Robert's case laid out in meticulous detail. The judge listened carefully, considering the psychiatric evaluations, the years of institutional silence, the legal limbo Robert had endured. In the end, a decision was handed down. Robert Hale would be transferred to a long-term care facility of his choosing, one with a history of patient-centered care and a reputation for respecting autonomy. Daniel had presented 3 options to Robert through the appointed social worker. The choice was ultimately Robert's, though he never spoke it aloud. Instead, he circled the name of a facility just outside Princeton, one that had gardens, art therapy programs, and private rooms. The administrators prepared the paperwork. The hospital packed his few possessions, and on a rainy Thursday morning, Robert Hale left the building where he had been invisible for nearly a decade. Linda came to see him 1 week later. The nursing home was quiet, shaded by old oaks and maples. Its halls didn't hum with fluorescent sterility, but breathed softly with age and care. She found Robert in a sunlit room near the end of the west wing. The window was open just enough to let in the breeze, and on the table beside him was a new leather-bound notebook. It lay closed when she entered, but before she could say anything, he opened it and began to write. It wasn't a drawing, it was a sentence. The words were careful, deliberate, shaped like something he hadn't trusted himself to do for a long time. He didn't hand the notebook to her, but he didn't hide it either. She sat beside him, watching as line after line formed. He didn't write for long, but when he stopped, there was something in his posture that had not been there before. A quiet assertion, the return of a self once buried under routine and silence. Over the next few weeks, Robert wrote daily. At first, they were fragments, memories of his classroom, descriptions of students whose names he still remembered, reflections on books he had loved, and the loneliness of being unheard. The facility staff, curious but respectful, gave him space. Linda continued to visit. She brought him old newspapers, pens of different colors, and sometimes just sat silently while he wrote. Daniel visited too, though less often now. His work had drawn national attention, and he had other clients. Still, he always left time for Robert. One day, a staff member from the local paper, someone who had followed Robert's story from the beginning, reached out to Daniel. They had heard from the nursing home that Robert had been writing, and they wanted to know if he would consider contributing a short piece. Not an interview, just a column. Something small. Daniel asked Robert through his advocate. He said yes. The first piece appeared the following Sunday. It was a short column titled, "What the Window Saw." In it, Robert described the view from his hospital room. He wrote about the seasons passing, the way light changed on the walls, the faces that came and went without knowing his name. He ended the column with a reflection on silence, not as emptiness, but as something that could be filled with observation, memory, and presence. The response was immediate and deeply emotional. Readers wrote in with letters of gratitude. Some shared their own stories of loved ones in care facilities. Others confessed they had forgotten to visit elderly relatives or had dismissed the silent presence of someone in their life. Robert's words had a gravity that only came from lived experience. His silence had spoken volumes, and now his words extended that truth. The paper gave him a regular space, a small column in the Sunday edition. It wasn't marketed as a feature, nor was it sensationalized. It was listed simply as Notes from RH. Each week, he chose what to share. Sometimes it was a memory from his childhood in rural Pennsylvania. Other times it was advice to young teachers or thoughts on patience, aging, or the importance of small kindnesses. He never addressed his ordeal directly. Not once did he mention the hospital or the years lost to its neglect. But every word he wrote was shaped by it. Linda clipped every column and saved them in a binder. So did others. A library in the city created an archive. Students began reading his pieces in classrooms. Professors used them in ethics courses. His face was never printed alongside the text, but readers came to know his voice. And that voice, gentle, deliberate, insistent in its quiet, became a symbol. In advocacy circles, Robert's case became a touchstone. His name was mentioned in legal briefs about patient rights and in testimony before state health committees. Journalists cited him in articles about nursing care, mental health reform, and medical accountability. His notebook pages were printed in newsletters and displayed at community events. But Robert remained always a man who preferred the corner of a room to the center of attention. He kept his life small, his circle even smaller. He greeted Linda with a slight nod, and when she brought him books, he sometimes underlined passages he found meaningful. He never spoke aloud, not once. But his silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a choice. And that choice, finally, was his to make. One winter afternoon, as snow began to fall lightly outside the windows, Robert handed Linda a folded page. It was not a column draft. It was not a note to the editor. It was just a single message. Some things are taken, but some things you take back. Bit by bit, word by word. Linda didn't respond. She simply placed her hand over the paper, holding it for a moment before slipping it into her coat pocket. Robert continued to write. As long as his hands allowed, he wrote. His words joined the quiet chorus of those who had been forgotten and now refused to disappear. His voice, once denied, had found its place again, not through volume or fury, but through consistency, depth, and truth. And though he may never have spoken aloud again, Robert Hale's words echoed farther than any of them could have imagined. Spring arrived slowly, melting away the remnants of winter in long, patient hours of soft rain and warming sun. The nursing home grounds shifted with the season. Crocuses emerged along the walkways and dogwood trees blossomed beside the old brick walls. The staff opened the windows more often, letting in the scent of earth and growth. In the West Wing, Robert Hale continued to write, his routine unbroken, his focus unwavering. His columns appeared each Sunday, and his handwriting grew smaller but steadier with each passing week. One morning in late April, a letter arrived for him. It was hand-delivered by the facility's receptionist, who placed it quietly on his bedside table. The envelope was thick and carefully addressed. The return stamp bore the name of a high school in upstate New York, the same school where Robert had once taught history for over 25 years. The letter was an invitation. The school was planning a commemorative event, an alumni gathering and dedication ceremony. Former teachers, students, and staff would be honored, and Robert Hale's name was listed among those being remembered for their impact. The principal extended a personal request for Robert to attend. They had read his columns. They knew his story now. They wanted to acknowledge not only his career, but the years lost to silence and the strength he had shown in reclaiming his voice. Robert sat with the letter in his lap for a long time. He did not open his notebook. He did not write immediately. He simply looked out the window, as he had so many times before, watching the petals drift in the breeze like fragments of thought. Later that day, he made a request through the nurse assigned to him. He would not be able to travel, he said through written words. The journey would be too difficult, but he wished to send something, a message, a statement to be read aloud. It would be brief, but it would be his. Over the next 2 days, he wrote carefully. The speech was not elaborate. It was not dramatic, but it carried weight. When it was finished, he handed it to Linda, who had come to visit after hearing about the letter. She did not read it immediately. She simply placed it inside an envelope and promised she would ensure it reached the right hands. A week later, at a spring ceremony in a sunlit gymnasium filled with students and alumni, a teenager stepped up to the microphone. He unfolded the page slowly and began to read. The words were about memory, about the cost of forgetting, about the quiet harm that can be done when people stop asking questions or when systems value procedure over humanity. Robert wrote about his classroom, about history not as a collection of dates but as a chain of decisions, some brave, some cowardly. He spoke of the years spent waiting for someone to notice, to ask, to care, and he ended with a simple plea: to listen to those who are silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that no one is listening. The room stood in the still silence for several moments after the speech ended. Back at the care facility, a small change had taken place outside Robert's room. For years, there had been only a number on the door. Just like in the hospital before, identities were often reduced to file folders and schedules. But now, beneath the number, a small nameplate had been affixed. It read, Robert Hale. The staff did not make an announcement. There was no ceremony. But those who had followed his story understood the significance. It was not just a name. It was a return of something taken, a restoration of presence. When Robert saw it for the first time, he paused for only a second. There was no visible change in his expression. He did not smile. He did not react with surprise or gratitude. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something he had long awaited and now quietly accepted. Inside the room, the space was orderly. The light fell through the windows in long, warm bands. On the nightstand lay his notebook. It was nearly full now. Pages and pages of reflections, sketches, letters, and pieces of thought that had once lived only in silence. He turned to the last page. There, drawn in soft pencil strokes, was a structure. A house, small and modest, a porch, a window with a tree in front. Details only someone who had once lived in such a place could recall so clearly. And beneath the drawing, a single sentence, printed in block letters. Now I am home. Robert closed the notebook and placed it gently beside the nameplate that bore his identity. The room was quiet. The world outside his window continued to bloom. Somewhere, others were reading his words. Others were remembering. Others were listening. And for the first time in a long time, Robert Hale was not just seen. He was known.